Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the opening lecture of the Congress. I'm pleased to introduce Andy Burnham to you. He was born in Liverpool, was educated there and subsequently in Cambridge, where he graduated in English. He entered Parliament in 2001 and became Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport in 2008. And then Secretary of State for Health in 2009. He is currently the Shadow Secretary of State for Health, and I would imagine would wish to assume his prior position, subject to the small matter of the election in about this time next year. He'll be talking on the subject of one person, one team, one system, making the NHS fit for the future. He's agreed to take questions after his talk. Andy.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honour, actually, to deliver this welcome lecture at this conference, this prestigious conference. And I'm humbled, actually, that you've given this role to a mere politician. I gather that not always political speeches, but so I'm very honoured to speak to you. I just wanted to begin with a small anecdote which is relevant to the worlds of politics and to surgery, because the political and the surgical worlds don't always have a great deal in common with each other, perhaps other than a mutual distrust at times. But I was lucky for part of my ministerial career to work with somebody who managed to operate in both, in politics and as a practicing surgeon. When I arrived in the Department of Health in 2009, it was my good fortune to have on my ministerial team the great Ara Darzi, who I'm sure will be known to you, world-leading colorectal surgeon. As well as being one of my health ministers at the time, though, he was continuing to practice his clinical practice at Imperial. And I remember asking him one day, how he managed to do it. I was saying, Ara, it must be really, really hard. One day you're in the Lords or the Commons having kind of late night meetings with MPs and peers, and then the very next day you're in surgery dealing with bowel cancer, kind of taking surgical sessions. And Ara said to me, he said, well, Andy, it's not as hard as you might imagine, actually. There's more in common with both worlds than you might realise. In both cases, I spend all day working with arseholes. And that really summed up our world, I guess. But rather than dwelling on that, I think I'll move on and explain really what I see as the big challenge facing you and us, all of us. I want to set the context for your discussions today by setting out the bigger picture, the context in which we are all now working as we look at a health system that is facing ever greater challenge, both in terms of demographic change, but also in terms of public spending and affordability. Periodically in our history, we've had moments when we've had to kind of examine from an existential basis whether or not the NHS can continue. And I think we're entering one of those moments now. We're beginning to hear those voices again saying, is it affordable? Is it sustainable? Will we need to introduce a form of charging? We've had various proposals floated in recent weeks. Will we need to ration care? And that kind of debate is coming. And I don't think we're alone. I think countries around the world are having a similar moment of introspection, because at the start of this century, the century of the ageing society, we've also had a financial crash. And I think that stark reality has come home to people everywhere. How are we going to make healthcare affordable and sustainable in this century when rising demand and the rising cost that comes from that demand is the big challenge? So we're at one of those moments now. And I wanted to give you my take on that and answer, if I may, three broad points, or make three arguments to you today. The first of those is that as we look towards the future and we think about the current context and the financial challenge we face, I want to argue to you today that rather than being the problem, or rather than needing to be whittled away in some way, the NHS model is in fact the answer to the challenges of the ageing society, to 21st century care. That's the first thing I wanted to say. The second is to go on to say what I see as the current threats to the NHS model of care that we've had in this country for 66 years. And then the third point is what my response is, what Labour's emerging response is to this current context, the emerging threats to the NHS model as I see them, and how we will make health and care sustainable in the 21st century. It will be sustainable. The NHS model will be sustainable, but in my view, only if it embraces major change in the way that services are delivered. So those are the three areas I wanted to address this afternoon. So let me start with why the NHS model is the right model. And when we talk of the NHS model, what is that? What am I describing there? I'm describing a model that is based around a planned public system of healthcare. And obviously, that stands in contrast to more market-oriented systems or more insurance-based systems that we see around the world. Now, I could make this afternoon a very emotional argument in support of the NHS, why it is something that we all relate to and identify with, why we celebrated it at the opening ceremony of our Olympic Games. For those visitors at the conference from international visitors, maybe that was a strange thing to see a country celebrating its health service at its Olympic Games. But I think that does tell you how emotionally connected people are to this NHS model we've had for 66 years. But I'm not actually going to make the emotional argument. What I want to do is make the evidence-based argument as to why the NHS model is the right one. I would say that 66 years of NHS history have shown that it is both the most cost-effective way and the fairest way of providing comprehensive cover of a decent standard to the whole population. If we judge that statement on those two criteria, firstly finance and care quality, that's the two ways in which we judge international health systems. Look at the G7, first on the finance question. If we take the G7, Britain is one of a small number of countries, or one of only a couple of countries, that spends less than 10% of its GDP providing a comprehensive universal health service of a decent standard. New figures have actually just been released today by the Office of National Statistics. Britain is currently spending 9.2% of its GDP on healthcare. Now, that is the lowest of the G7 countries. Italy is the same, actually, 9.2%. Then, from there, you look at the rest. Japan, 9.6%, Canada, 11.2%, Germany, 11.3%, France, 11.6%, the United States, 17.7%. Now, what does that list tell us? I think if you look at that list, what that tells you is that the more market-oriented the system is, the more it costs. The planned systems tend to cost less. The Italian system has many similarities to the NHS, so does the Canadian system. As you move towards a more market-based system, the costs tend to increase. And that, I would say, is the evidence from around the world. The Commonwealth Fund regularly identifies the NHS as the most cost-effective system in the world. And why is this the case? It's because of the fundamental strength that we have in the N in NHS. That N in NHS gives us, as a country, the ability at national level to set out what can be afforded and provided. For instance, what we can afford to pay our doctors, nurses, our staff, where we choose to locate our complex services and plan them to optimise their configuration. What service standards we can afford to give to the public, be it in terms of operation waiting times, the 18-week standard, or through the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, what treatments we can afford to pay for. That N in NHS gives us that ability to control our costs at national level, where more market-based systems don't have that. You know, there is more competitive inflationary pressure at local level that drives up staff costs, that drives up other costs, and leads to duplication in the way services are configured. So I would say in a century when rising demand and cost are the big challenges, why would we throw this away? Why would we weaken this model, this planned model of healthcare that is proven to be cost effective? I think that we wouldn't, and that's my argument. That's the first thing I would say. But then the challenge would come. People would say, well, it may be cost effective, but planned systems are always weaker on care standards. And that was an argument, you know, we heard made very strongly in the United States during the long-running debate on Obamacare, that, you know, here in the NHS there were much lower standards of care. But again, there is no evidence for it. In fact, the NHS is now routinely coming out at the top of the Commonwealth Fund's league table on care standards. So it's managed to achieve those two things, an efficient service that hasn't compromised on care quality. Yes, of course, there have been failings in the NHS in recent times, but overall, the system is providing good care to the majority of people, ranked second by the Commonwealth Fund across the world. So that is the strength that we have at the beginning of this century. And the question is, you know, what do we do with that in terms of planning for the future? I think if you look at that evidence from around the world, it tells you pretty clearly that market-based systems cost more, not less, than planned systems. But actually there's something else too. I would say that market-based systems in the end deliver more fragmented care, more players on the pitch, when actually the future demands integrated care. So that is the kind of first argument that I make. To move on to the second point that I wanted to address, it's the question of, well, what is the threat to this system? You know, is there a threat to the NHS? And if so, what is it? And I believe that there is a threat to the NHS model that we've had for 66 years. Despite the evidence that I've just put before you, a drive has been underway for about 25 years in this country, since about the early 1990s, to push the NHS ever more towards a more market-based system. And that is not to make a political point, because it's happened under governments of both colours. This idea that we just allow ever more experimentation with the market in the system. Now, that has been going on, as I say, for some time, and it was very much started in the 1990s and then nudged further in that direction in the last decade. But the Health and Social Care Act of 2012, I think, lets the genie out of the bottle. It potentially creates the circumstances in which the ability to plan services is lost. The bill has a requirement that commissioners should tender all services on the open market. That fundamentally weakens the ability of the planning function in health care. It requires Monitor to promote competition actively. That is a major change. And it also gives, for the first time, a formal role to the UK competition authorities. And we saw last year, for the first time in our healthcare system, the Competition Commission intervening to block collaboration between two hospitals in the south of England on the basis that it was, quote, anti-competitive. Now, this is a major departure for healthcare in this country. We had the statement from the former chief executive of the NHS, just departed, who said, quotes, that the NHS is now bogged down in a morass of competition law. So through the Health and Social Care Act, I think we've had a major change. A moment has passed where the NHS has been moved into a different position, and it's now in the full glare of EU competition and procurement law because of this requirement openly to tender services. Once you've made that your position, it means that contracts can be challenged by private and independent sector organisations. We have a report in the Health Service Journal that around half of clinical commissioning groups have now received informal challenges to their contracting decisions from external bodies. So that's what the Health and Social Care Act has done. And now there's another threat that, in my view, threatens to take this to a whole new level. And that is a treaty that's being negotiated in Brussels right now with the US, a new US-EU trade treaty, or TTIP, as it is known. This is a treaty which is about liberalising trade between the EU and the US. And it is the formal position of the current government that it is not seeking to exempt health from the treaty, i.e. health is in scope, from their point of view, in terms of the content of this treaty. And that is a departure from the traditional European position. The Lisbon Treaty says that governments can exempt health from competition and procurement law. A treaty recently negotiated with the Canadian government, a European treaty, exempts health because the Canadian system has many similarities to European, or certainly the British system. But the current proposal is that the EU-US trade treaty won't exempt health. And if that happens, we are in a completely different ballgame, because then the NHS is then very much subject to the global market, where organisations can challenge the decisions of commissioners here from anywhere in Europe or in the US. And if that were to happen, I think the NHS loses the cards. It doesn't hold the cards anymore. It can't plan in the way that it used to, because decisions will be challenged. So the genie, as I said a moment ago, for me would be very much out of the bottle, and it would be impossible to put it back in. And that is why I believe the two things together, the Health and Social Care Act and this EU-US trade treaty, would actually threaten irreversible change to the health system that we've had for 66 years in this country. So that's the threat, and then it brings me on then to the third and final part of what I wanted to say to you this afternoon. So what? What is Labour's response? What are you going to do about it? I have thought carefully about all of these issues. I've thought about the nature of 21st century care, the challenges that it is bringing to us all in terms of how we look after people. We are living in a time when it will be the norm for people to live into their 90s or even beyond. It's a time when we will be all dealing with the social consequences that come from lifestyle, disease caused by lifestyle, a very big difference from the 20th century that gave birth to the NHS. And I think this century requires us to rethink how care is provided. When we think of somebody in their 90s, they have multiple needs, physical, mental and social. And I don't think it's possible anymore to run a system of care that separates social care from mental and physical care. Because when you reach your late 80s or 90s or even beyond, care just becomes a blur of all three. And you need a system that can see the whole person. So I would argue that the care we need has to be highly integrated, highly personalised and preventative in its nature. And I don't believe the market would get us there. I believe, in fact, it would erect barriers to the kind of service change that we need. If our system is to become sustainable, we need to see collaboration between hospitals like Bournemouth and Poole that I mentioned earlier. We should be encouraging that, not erecting barriers between professional and clinical collaboration between different hospitals. We need a sense of one team around the person in their own home, rather than a world where we're contracting to bring ever-increasing numbers of providers onto the pitch, where we have a situation where there are more and more separate entities dealing with one person's care, intensifying the frustration that people feel already of having to tell the same story to everybody who comes through the door. So for me, 21st century care has got to be about collaboration over competition. It's got to be about integration over fragmentation and people before profits. So how do I do that from where we are today? Well, we start by repealing the Health and Social Care Act 2012 in the first Queen's speech of the next Labour government. It has put the wrong values, in my view, at the heart of the NHS, and it represents a threat to its future. Now, please don't read that as, oh my God, another reorganisation. I think people like me, down the years, have repeatedly made the mistake that a new policy needs new organisations to deliver it, and of course it doesn't. Andrew Lansley could have saved many people a lot of heartache if he'd simply delivered clinical commissioning by putting doctors in control of PCTs. I don't believe we needed to go through this colossal reorganisation that we've just seen. So for that reason, I know that the NHS actually is feeling degraded at the moment. Its capacity has been ground down. Its resilience has been weakened, and it would be irresponsible in the extreme if I were to come along and say, do you know what? We're going to do it all again. We're going to stand down these organisations, and we're going to bring back some different ones. So while I'll repeal the Health and Social Care Act, I won't put the NHS through another structural reorganisation. I will simply work with the organisations I inherit, principally the health and wellbeing boards, which I think bring that broader social perspective on health, where we have local government and NHS working together. So we start by repealing the Health and Social Care Act. Secondly, we have an exemption for the NHS from the EU-US treaty, but more than that, we claim our exemption for the NHS from EU procurement and competition law. So we allow the NHS to collaborate, to remodel in the way that it needs to, without going through all of this costly and bureaucratic tendering exercise. So that's the second thing we do. But then from there, from those foundations, I think we have to build a very different system. We need to build an NHS that can see the whole person. And this brings me actually to what I would say is probably now the NHS's greatest flaw. For all the great praise I've lavished on it today, it has a really big flaw that we kind of managed to get round in the 20th century, but now is actually the barrier to us providing 21st century care. And that is the exclusion of the social from the original NHS settlement. Back in 1948, when the NHS was brought into being, you will all be familiar with the definition of health that the World Health Organization set out in that year. Health is, quotes, a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Well, for all of its great strength, the NHS has never been set up to deliver that vision because the social side of care was excluded from it. So what has developed in this country is a very much a medical model of care, a treatment model, not actually a prevention model of support. And I think now, this is with the way society is changing, the way society is aging, this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. because the 21st century is asking questions now of this 20th century model that it just cannot answer to the public's satisfaction. People want mum or dad to have high quality integrated support, but what they find is it isn't there. We have a very much fragmented system, very silo-based working, where people are passed from pillar to post as they search for the support that they need. And I don't think that can carry on. It won't provide the standards of care that we aspire to for people, but it won't be financially sustainable either. We've had a situation in this country for a long time now where we have put political priority on protecting the NHS budget, but we have cut social care really to the bone. To the point where, in England in 2014, it gives me no pleasure or pride to say this, we have a malnourished, minimum wage, 0 hours social care system that, quite frankly, is not capable of providing the standard of care that you would aspire to for your parents. I certainly do for mine, but indeed we should all aspire to for everybody's parents. You know, we are sending the message out to young people who work in this care system that looking after someone else's parents is the lowest calling that they can answer as a career, as a vocation, rather than what it should be, the highest. And we hear in the news today of more abuses in care homes uncovered by the media. How long are we going to allow this to carry on? We need, in my view, to rethink fundamentally how we care for older people. And we need urgently to build a better care system that is based around the person, that looks after all of their need in a single service approach. So what I am beginning to describe to you is bringing the social element of care into the NHS. Having an NHS that is capable of seeing the whole person, that can start with the whole person in their home and optimise and personalise support for them and for their family. If we don't make this change, I think we're looking at a very bleak future. We're looking at a situation where we will just be cutting support in people's homes and hospitalising ever-increasing numbers of older people. As many of you will be familiar, if you were to ask the chief executive of any acute trust in England today how many people are in the hospital occupying acute beds that oughtn't to have ended up there or now can't be discharged because there isn't support for them back at home, they will typically say it's around a third. You know, for the want of spending a few £100s in people's homes, we seemingly are happy as a society to spend thousands of pounds keeping people in acute hospital beds, which is often the worst place for them to be. This urgently needs to be turned on its head. You know, the incentives at the moment in the system are all wrong. Hospitals are getting paid by every person who comes through A&E or comes through the door. You know, an activity-based model of funding. Well, we can't sustain that anymore. We need to move to a social model of care that starts in people's homes based on the full integration of health and social care. Hospitals increasingly full of older people is no answer to the challenges of the ageing society. And I believe we now need to face up to that and make urgent changes to the way we provide care. So let me just conclude by saying that I believe the NHS model is the right model for the 21st century. It is the best way, the best hope we have of managing these costs and making a system affordable for everybody that actually looks after everybody, even when there are challenges, rising challenges coming from us, from everybody living longer. So, yes, it's the right model, but the time has come to reset it for the 21st century and to reset it as a whole person service. You know, that for me is the only way to go. A social model of support that starts in people's homes and is actually based around helping people help themselves, helping families do more to take responsibility for their own care. At the moment, the system asks far too much of people, of carers in their own homes. It leaves them to fend for themselves, waits for them to fail, and then spends thousands of pounds treating people in hospital beds. We've got to do things differently. We've got to personalise, we've got to get in there early and support people so that they can help themselves and look after themselves. I think the health and care system in England right now is at a crossroads. If we just carry on as we are, we will end up with a market-based system. I think the time has come to have that debate, have a very, very clear choice before people at the next general election in 2015. What kind of health and care system do we want in this country? I have made my choice. My choice is a public planned system that's person-centred and that's preventative, and as I say, puts people before profits. That's the choice I've made. I'm grateful to this conference and to all of you for giving me the opportunity to put it before you today, and I would be very, very open to receiving any questions from you on any of the points that I've made. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that talk, and we're grateful you've agreed to take questions, and I would invite anybody who wishes to come and make a question to come to one of the microphones and identify yourself before you talk. May I take the opportunity just to ask you something first? I think many of us, probably all of us in this auditorium, would agree with you that the problem of unscheduled care, from our perspective, is one of the major ones that we face in the hospital service. And your analysis about people in beds that don't need to be, but also in the flows of patients that are coming through A&E because of the failure of primary care is paramount. Now, I think I know no trust that would say because they're getting a tariff for each one of the A&E attendances that this is good for them. Frankly, it is not. It's making the system impossible to work. But my worry is that we live in a system where cash is limited, and if you move a great deal of that expenditure out of the hospital sector and into social care, frankly, it is perhaps a bottomless pit. And so I think that would be the concern about that aspect of your talk from my perspective.
It's a very legitimate concern. And shall I just answer that as the first question? Because I think you're absolutely right. And it would be very destabilising to do that. So let me explain what I have in mind. In just a further point of context, I think what we are seeing in the NHS at the moment is not just the cuts to social care that I've described, which has in practice taken away home-based care from around 250,000 older people in the last couple of years. We've also seen cuts to general practice, and that is, I think, in a very serious condition right now, and cuts to mental health. And for me, that isn't sustainable because it's just building more and more and more pressure on the A&E and the hospital. It is meaning that planned or elective work is being disrupted because of the pressure on beds. You know, we're running a hospital-based model of care that's not sustainable. So how do I answer your challenge? I think we have got to give the service the ability to evolve into a different way of working. So let me just answer the point directly. Rather than an episodic tariff that we pay to hospitals for every individual episode of care, one proposal I have in mind is a year of care. Let's say for somebody in their 90s with dementia, a single budget that covers not just their physical and mental support for the year, but also their social support. And you can start to think of a combined budget like that if you fully integrate health and social care, the funds that councils and the NHS has. So if you had a year of care that in fact was paid to the acute trust, you give the incentive to the acute trust to begin to move people out of the hospital and into the home. Because obviously, the more that they support somebody at home and keep them comfortable and coping, the more the year of care the less risk to the organisation that you would, the less financial risk, because you would obviously be optimising optimising their care. Now, that is about putting a different incentive at the heart of the system, a system that pulls toward prevention. I see, over time, if you were to go down this path, the DGH evolving into an integrated care provider, working from home to hospital, providing the full spectrum of care, physical, mental, social. I don't see that as something you would do in a big bang way. I think it has to be evolutionary, but I think that's the way to go, to build a different kind of system. And I think the Royal College of Physicians' work on Future Hospital very much offers a blueprint for how that change might begin to be made.
Thank you. I think we could debate that for a long time. So we're limited for time, so we have 4 people at 4 microphones, and so we'll take all of those questions and then we will move on. So, number 1.
Thank you very much. My name is Ed Fitzgerald. I'm a General Surgery Registrar from London. A topic very close to the heart of many surgical trainees and a major factor in delivering the healthcare plan that you outline is the hours in which we're able to work to deliver them.
Yep.
And I'd be really interested to hear your plans in relation to the European Working Time Regulations in healthcare.
Okay, thank you. One by one? Well, I think it's time to review it, isn't it? And if there needs to be change, I mean, I was involved in the department at the time when the new rules came in, and I think while we can see some of the problems it's created, I think also let's remember why. You know, that it couldn't be right, could it, that we had junior doctors working all hours of the day, the night, the weekend too. That was not going to provide safe care. But the question is, in trying to kind of put forward a very laudable purpose, have the rules also conflicted with the way rotas operate to optimise the most effective delivery of care? And I think there is some evidence you could say that they have, and I think some greater flexibility is needed. So I would say let's not dispense entirely with the principle. I think it is right that people are protected in terms of the hours that they're forced to work. I think in the debate after the Francis report, I don't think we would want to go back to a world where people were tired and they were being overloaded with work. I think there is already some evidence that hospitals are operating way beyond safe bed occupancy levels, as I've indicated, and that I think is causing significant strain on doctors, but also nursing staff too. So they're operating in a very difficult climate. But at the same time, I think more flexibility will be needed if we are to make 7-day working a reality. So I'm open-minded. I'm open-minded about that. If we need to go back to Europe, then we will. You know, I'm pro-European, but that for me should mean driving a tough bargain with Europe at times and saying, look, this isn't working for us. You know, it's not going to work for us if you put health in the EU-US trade treaty, or we need some changes to the Working Time Directive to better reflect the needs of the healthcare system. So I'm always open to do those things. I think the time is probably right to review in great detail how the European Working Time Directive has worked, particularly with a view to our ambition to move to 7-day working. So I wouldn't think there'd be a great deal of difference between myself and the government on that particular issue.
Thank you. Microphone 2.
Afternoon, Andy. Jim Johnson, more or less retired consultant surgeon. Simple question. If you, as you said, repealed the Health and Social Care Act, but effectively kept the bodies and institutions that it had set up and worked with them, I think that's what you said, what difference would we as doctors, or indeed patients, see in the future?
Thank you, Jim. Good to see you again. And I think there would be a difference in that I would be the first person to support clinical involvement in commissioning, indeed GP involvement in commissioning. That is a good thing, it seems to me. But I think GP domination or even control of commissioning is in the end a bad thing, because it mixes two worlds, the worlds of provision and the world of commissioning, and it creates a conflict of interest. And I think it is also not clear to me why one part of the clinical profession should be elevated above others. I think the challenges of modern healthcare are such that you need a partnership of clinicians from across the service, redesigning services, and everybody with a sense that they have a stake in that. So that's one change I think you would see. But the second is I would want to make a shift in commissioning from what I would describe as the medical model, which we currently have, where health service professionals commission health services from other health service professionals, to a social model of commissioning. And that's why I would make the Health and Wellbeing Board preeminent. I would legislate for its preeminence in this system, because I think the 21st century absolutely demands that. We will not rise to the challenge of improving people's health in this century if we don't make the link between health and housing policy, health and planning policy, health and leisure policy, health and education policy, the full Michael Marmot agenda. You know, we have to start building new homes, for instance, Jim, to make the point, with care in mind. We shouldn't be building new homes without thinking this is the place where we would want to aspire to provide care if we could do. Therefore, let's build the homes that will support that. That's one example. Or we shouldn't be designing town and city centres, in my view now, without prioritising the pedestrian and the cyclist over the motorist, so that we can build more healthy communities. So we've got to make these linkages, it seems to me, between health and the other public policy areas. And that, I think, is another change that you would see. The last one I would point to is what I would describe as person-centred care as opposed to patient-centred care. If you fully integrate health and social care, if you bring together physical, mental, social into one service, it allows something truly radical. And that is, it allows you to see the whole person. And therefore, it allows a much greater degree of personalisation of care than the current system is able to achieve. So you can start in the person's home, and you can optimise support for people from there. And you have to say to the public that going forward, they should expect to be treated in their own home if they can be, rather than a hospital. And obviously that has big implications for hospitals and their configuration, but I think it's something that we've now got to face up to.
So we have to finish, but we have to get two people who have been standing at the microphone for a while. Wonder if I could ask you both to put your question very briefly, and then we have about 2 minutes, and
sure.
Then we have to stop.
No.
So microphone 3 first.
W3A, a consultant surgeon and a medical director, and I agree with a lot of what you say about collaboration and competition and the balance. I'll leave aside your slightly rich comment about hospitals admitting people for the tariff, given that it was your government that introduced payment by results. And in clear conscience, I have never admitted a patient for the money, and I don't think any of my clinicians have either. They've done it because there's nowhere else. But my main point is really a plea for the sake of the NHS. What we really need is to stop the NHS being a political football, and at times the atmosphere between yourself and your Secretary of State colleague is unedifying and doesn't help us. And please take it away from the political football and do what we all want, is to look after the care of the NHS and the patients.
Thank you. Microphone 4.
Hello, Jamie Crinning, Clinical Director and Consultant Surgeon. Two very brief points. What's your long-term view of the use of the private sector, which is invariably taking money out of the pot? And the second point is, what's your view on these numerous KPIs, sequins, performance indicators, punitive fines moving forward? Because a trust's income is very difficult to calculate or maximise, and it's becoming a minefield.
Yeah. Okay.
So thank you very much for addressing these 2 points in 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll do it. Yep, I will stick to that. Well, thank you, Dermot. Maybe just would have a chance to explain my comment more. I'm not accusing hospitals of, oh, we get the money, therefore we keep admitting. We created that system, and it's the way the incentive works, isn't it? We haven't funded social care adequately, and hospitals get paid by episodes. So we've got a system that is geared towards hospitalisation, and I think that's created by us. So I'm not blaming anybody here. It's Parliament and Westminster that's got to change that. And on the point about a political football, no, I fully understand the point you're saying, and that's why I have said I won't do another reorganisation, and it's actually why I made an offer to Andrew Lansley when the bill was going through, saying, look, I'll talk to you about how we deliver your aim of clinical commissioning, as long as you call off the bill and the reorganisation. You know, we'll do it, we'll work with you, we'll support it. And obviously he didn't want to do that. And the problem is, when you say, you know, make it a political football, well, I'm afraid the Health and Social Care Act has done that, because it's planted these values of the market in the system. You know, the current government in opposition said, oh, there'll be no reorganisation, we'll leave things as they are. And they didn't stick to that. So for somebody who believes passionately and fundamentally in the NHS, I can't leave that, because I think it's on a path to destruction, to fragmentation. So we have to have a political debate about that, because otherwise we're going to end up with a market-based healthcare system. So I understand your frustration, I understand the sympathy with which it was greeted, but I hope you'll understand why, for somebody who believes in what I believe, that I don't believe it's right to leave this Health and Social Care Act in place. And on the question of, you know, the relations between myself and my opposite number, I think we have personally seen a deliberate attempt to run down the NHS. I think we've seen a climate created. I think some of the care failure has been politicised, and there's been a deliberate attempt to point the finger at hospitals, to create a climate of concern around the NHS, to, in my view, soften up public opinion for people to say, oh, well, the NHS isn't working, we might have to go for more private solutions. So, you know, that is the climate that has been created, and obviously I have to respond to that. On the second point, on the use of the private sector, don't hear this as saying that, you know, I'm not saying that there isn't a role for the private sector or the voluntary sector. There is a role. But it's a role that should be planned, you know, where it's right to bring in the private sector, where some more innovation is needed, where there is a service that's failing. Do it on a careful and a planned basis. The old David Nicholson phrase was a rifle shot rather than carpet bombing. You know, if you've got a service that's failing, well, yeah, go out and stir things up and make them come up with ideas for improvement. But don't go to this thing where we're just tendering everything out. Finally, on the fines point, I take the point entirely. I think what we've got to do is build a collaborative system where, across a health service, people, clinician to clinician, develop solutions together and work together to make 21st century care a reality. And having fines for one bit of the system against another probably doesn't help achieve that. So I've probably gone over my 2 minutes there, as I can, as the chair is letting me know. But anyway, thank you for the opportunity. Enjoy your conference, and thank you to you all for hearing what I've had to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much.